2.5 years ago I started this channel to talk to you about video games, related technology and maybe even a sprinkling of other geekery. I had no intention to start a video game collection again until 2021, very early in 2021, 2 years ago in fact, and I did get the bug hard. And if you want to see how much has come into the collection over those last 2 years, you just wait until after these. Now I'm going to start with the PlayStation 2 because it's the biggest focus of the collection at the moment, and it's a part of the collection where you're likely to see just about everything, or at least a little bit of everything. When it comes to the other systems in the collection, I'm definitely a little bit more focused. But with the PS2, as you can see from this footage, the collection is absolutely all over the place. It's got everything from must-have games in the system to the truly awful games that came out on the system as well. So if licensed games and sports games pique your interest at all, well, this is the part of the collection that will interest you the most. Not likely, but this is it. But of course that doesn't mean it's all just bad games. No, there's a few classics in here too, and as we get to them we'll probably pull them off the shelf and have a deeper look into those particular titles. Oh, and be forewarned that you're going to get a few different systems mixed in with other systems because I just don't have the space for everything at the moment. So systems like the N64, where I only have these 3 titles, they're just sitting snugly with the PlayStation 2. Now I do intend to expand my N64 library, but that's something on the back burner unless something spectacular just pops up at any given moment. So let's get back to the PlayStation 2 and finish off this top corner shelf, because I do live in a gaming corner. I don't have the space that a lot of people have, but I make the most of it. Dropping down a level, you're going to see something else that you'll see a fair bit of, and that's the tat that I like to decorate the shelves with. Some of it gaming related and some of it not, and if you take note of the Mentats tin at the end, that was a gift from a good friend, a friend that crafted that with their own hands. Moving back onto the games on the shelf, you're going to see some important titles now, and that is the Final Fantasy titles. Final Fantasy X, X-2 and Final Fantasy XII. Now of course Final Fantasy XII was where Square fired a warning shot across our bows to let us know that Final Fantasy was about to change. Now Final Fantasy XII is a very playable game, a very enjoyable game, but it was without a doubt an indication that Final Fantasy, or Final Fantasy that I had grown to love, wasn't going to be with us for much longer. But not to worry, because this shelf also contains Disgaea and Grandia 2, 2 JRPGs that absolutely took the sting out of Final Fantasy XII, drifting away from the turn-based combat that I absolutely adore. Moving around the corner, there's yet more tat, or as I like to call them, Shelf Guardians. Now I'm by no way, shape or form a big collector of the Disney Infinity characters, but they do look good and they can be extremely cheap. So occasionally when I come across one in the wild that's absolutely dirt cheap and it looks fantastic like these 4, I'm more than happy to add them to the collection. And on the shelf that is guarded by the Avengers and Johnny Depp, there's not a great deal of standout titles, but from that bunch the Gran Turismo games are definitely up there with some of my favourites on the system. Decorating the shelf below are some of my more important non-PlayStation 2 game items, because it's on this shelf that I not only have my Mario and Zelda Game & Watch devices, but also my wonderful YouTuber of the Year trophy that was sent to me courtesy of Retro Ed UK, and I think he done a splendid job in the hair. What do you think? As for the games on the shelf, well, there's a few notable titles here. We have the Hitman games, the Jak and Daxter games. For me, the Kessen games are a standout. Kessen was a launch title on the PlayStation 2 for me over here in Scotland, and being a strategy game set in feudal Japan, it had everything that I looked for in a game. The Kingdom Hearts are also on this shelf, and let's not forget Leisure Suit Larry, because coming from a PC background, well, you just couldn't avoid Leisure Suit Larry in the late 80s and early 90s. Well, you could avoid them if you wanted to, but you would just display that you had no sense of humour if you did. Around the corner, the shelf is protected by none other than Super Mario and Princess Daisy. They also have a Death Star, don't ask why, it just is. And along with the PlayStation 2 games on that shelf, they also guard my only 2 Super Nintendo games. Again, it's a collection that I do intend on expanding, but just not at the moment, unless like the N64, something spectacular pops up out of the blue and I just have to grab it. As for the PlayStation 2 games on this particular shelf, well, we have the wonderful Manhunt. Still looking for Manhunt 2, but that can be a bit pricey, especially on the PlayStation 2. The Metal Gear Solid games, of course, are in here, and they were some of the first games that I sourced. And towards the end of the shelf, we have the Onimusha games. I do have the first 3, but I'm still looking for number 4. And once that's safely in the collection, I might even get round to playing them. The next shelf down has 4 very special guardians indeed. We have the wonderful Raphael, Michelangelo, Donatello and Leonardo. And right slap bang in the middle, R2-D2, but he hides a secret that I'll show you towards the end of this particular video. Now of course the games on this shelf include the letter R. And for anyone who's a PlayStation fan, you know the letter R can mean only one thing, and that is Resident Evil. Now of course there's other important games for the PlayStation that start with the letter R, Ratchet and Clank of course. But for me, my personal journey started with Resident Evil on the PlayStation way back in 1996. And although I don't have every Resident Evil game for the PlayStation 2, it is a subset that I do intend to complete at some point. I am however very pleased with the Steelbook Special Edition for Resident Evil 4 that I have, despite the fact that I absolutely hate that game. And yes, if you want to judge me for that, then that's what the comments are for, so drop down there and let me know what you think. And if you haven't already, why don't you subscribe while you're there, and you can throw even more judgment at me in future videos. Around the corner of this shelf we see the starts of my Atari 2600 collection, which is an important console to collect for, especially if you're my age, because it was very likely the very first console you ever got your hands on, and that was the case for me. As for the PlayStation 2 games on this shelf, well, we're deep into the S now in Shadow Hearts. What a wonderful horror role-playing game with a fantastic battle mechanic. We also have the wonderful Silent Hill 2, which is getting the remake treatment as we sit here watching this, or maybe it's already out depending when you watch this. Soul Reaver 2, but more importantly Space Invaders Invasion Day, because if you learn one thing about me today, other than the fact that I love JRPGs, especially Final Fantasy, that I'll also buy just about anything that has Space Invaders attached to it, because quite simply it was the first arcade that I ever played, and I have very fond memories of that arcade cabinet indeed. Dropping down a shelf, it's home to more Atari 2600. Now I don't have a massive Atari 2600 collection because there's only a few games out there that I really want in the collection. That's not saying all the games that I have here are games that were must have for me, but I was lucky enough to find a decent bundle at a very decent price, and when you come across a deal in the wild, well, you've just got to take it. I'm very happy with the selection that I have, and I will of course add more as time goes on, because yes, Space Invaders still isn't in the collection, and that is a must have for me. Now the PlayStation 2 games on this shelf really let my geek flag fly, and no, I'm not talking about my love for SpongeBob SquarePants, but more so my love for all things Star Wars and Star Trek. But most importantly on this particular shelf we have Suikoden 4, Suikoden 5 and Suikoden Tactics. And anyone who knows me will quite readily tell you that the Suikoden franchise is one that I hold in high regard, so much so that it competes with the Final Fantasy franchise. The eagle-eyed will have spotted that there is no Suikoden 3 there, and the reason for that is it never got a PAL release. I will get it into the collection eventually, but it does mean I'll have to import it, and that's something that I'm probably going to have to do in the very near future. Around this corner homes the last of the Atari 2600 games, and only 2 of them of any real note, that being Epic's California games, which is awful on whatever system you play it, and Super Breakout, because Breakout is just one of those era defining games that you should have in your collection, and you should definitely give it a play if you've never played any Breakout games before. Now at the very bottom shelf, and the last of the PlayStation 2 games. Nothing really much of note here, but 13 is an interesting game if you get the chance to play it, but I hear of course that you shouldn't play the remaster, and currently filling the void that will eventually be filled with more juicy PlayStation 2 games is a temporary home for my DS Lite, my PlayStation Vita and my 8-bit DOE arcade stick. Now as promised, here is the R2-D2 container and what it contains, and it's quite simply my Game Boy Advance collection at the moment. Now I'm not collecting heavily for the Game Boy Advance at the moment, but there are a few titles that I do want into the collection. Now there were quite a few of these that were gifted to me by a good friend who went on to gift other things, but you'll see that later on anyway. So not every one of these games that you're seeing here are games that I actively went out and hunted because I wanted them into the collection. And of this collection there are only 2 games that I did go out and buy myself, and that was Bubble Bobble, the wonderful Bubble Bobble, and Breath of Fire 2 because I've never played the game before, and I absolutely adore Breath of Fire 3 and Breath of Fire 4 on the PlayStation. All the rest were kindly donated and totally appreciated at that. Now the PlayStation 5 collection I have is very small, and that's quite simply because it's a new machine and the games, they must jump out at me. Alan Wake was a must play. I love the Dark Pictures anthology games, and I have also fallen in love with the Far Cry games. Horizon Forbidden West was another must-have game, although I couldn't buy it straight away. Thanks for that, Jen and Scott over at Retro Rivals. Immortals, I was told that was like Breath of the Wild but not so empty, so that was another one that I had to get into my hands at the time. Judgment, which is part of the Yakuza universe, was an absolute must-have for me. Ratchet and Clank and Soulstorm, well, if you're going to pull on the nostalgia strings, you're definitely going to pull me in as well, so that explains them. And Spider-Man Miles Morales, simply because Spider-Man was such a great game in 2018. Now PlayStation 4 I'm much more happy to collect in bulk for. Well, that's quite simply down to the fact that not only is it still current gen, but also the cost for collecting PlayStation 4 is minuscule at the moment. So what we have is a wonderful selection of games that run really well on the PlayStation 5, let me put that out there straight away. Some incredibly important titles that will be classics in the years to come, but also there is this trend towards releasing remasters and remakes of older games. And you can see that in the likes of the Disgaea Complete collection that I have up there, as well as the wonderful Alex Kidd and Miracle World DX. And also, let's be honest, Sony's PlayStations every generation have always had a great selection of RPGs, be it turn-based, strategy or even action. And as we get to the end of this particular section of the collection, I'm sure a few eagle-eyed people out there will notice that there's a selection of FIFA games in there. And I'm not going into detail just now, but yes, there is a role-playing aspect to those FIFA games up there, and that's why they're there. And yes, dropping down a shelf, you're going to notice the same sort of themes that you saw above. You're going to see a lot of JRPGs, you're going to see a lot of action adventures, and scattered about in there you're going to see some retro games remastered for the PlayStation 4. And just ever so occasionally you might even see a Just Dance, and that tends to be down to the better half, who does absolutely adore to troll me by bringing games like Just Dance and SingStar into the collection. Of course, some of the standout titles in this particular shelf for me include the Final Fantasy games, the absolutely outstanding Persona 5, and the Ni no Kuni games. Well, at least one of the Ni no Kuni games here. I do have the remastered Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch on digital form, and I will get it in physical at some point, but I'm in no real hurry. Now this last segment of the PlayStation 4 collection has some absolutely must-have games in it. Of course, you have Until Dawn, Supermassive's first game, and let me tell you, that one blew me away. The fantastic Valkyria Chronicles, and I've got to thank Tom over at Sega Head for pointing me in the direction of this particular game. Witcher the Wild Hunt, that's another game, if you haven't played it you really need to get to it right now. And the Yakuza games, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I just can't get enough of Kiryu, or Majima for that matter either. And Yakuza Like a Dragon, well, that's a game that plays like the Final Fantasy VII remake that we should have had. And I'll just leave that thought with you, and you can maybe drop down into the comments if you agree with me or not. Moving on to the PlayStation 3 collection, and oh my, the 7th generation of gaming is something special indeed. Now don't get me wrong, I've loved gaming ever since 1977 when I first had a Pong paddle put into my hands, and every generation of gaming that came after it had something special to offer, and I have a fond place in my heart for them all. But the 7th generation was when things started to become real. Now obviously, if you look at the early games like Oblivion and compare them to something like Cyberpunk running on a PlayStation 5, well, the difference is almost night and day. But as the 7th generation progressed and developers got to grips with the new technology, things progressed at a lightning pace, taking us from those early graphics that were absolutely stunning at the time all the way up to The Last of Us, which was pretty much the pinnacle of that generation. And of course, it's when online features and online gaming was truly adopted by consoles. And yes, PC gamers had online gaming for a while before this, and of course you could also play online with some games on the PlayStation 2 and the Dreamcast and Xbox. But it really was the 7th generation that brought online gaming and more especially online features to the forefront of console gaming, and for me it was all much more about the social aspect of online gaming rather than the competitive nature that most people get into it for. And of course trophies, so I need to do a big shout out to Bill at Retro Gamer Boy for bringing us trophies to our gaming experience. And another beauty of the PlayStation 3 and collecting for PlayStation 3 is that it's becoming the new PlayStation 2, and by that for me I just simply mean that there's a range of titles out there, such a huge range of titles, and the prices aren't too bad at the moment. Yes, there'll be one or two examples where you might have to shell out a few quid more. On the whole, there is a huge library out there of decent games, as well of course some of those wonderful bad licensed games that I do love to bring into the collection. Now, the Sony PlayStation was where I totally committed myself from switching from PC gaming, microcomputer gaming, and almost exclusively onto console gaming, and that was all down to Resident Evil, but that's another story. And of course, as you're looking over these PlayStation titles that are panning by at the moment, you will notice that there's some ZX Spectrum games above and some blank spines. Now, those blank spines have GameCube games in that I got loose from a friend, and of course down the line I will show you what was in those cases. But back to the Sony PlayStation, because it was such a revelation when I got my hands on it in 1996. Having been almost exclusively a PC and microcomputer gamer, the Sony PlayStation was the first time where I sat down with a console and I thought to myself, yes, consoles can actually deliver the games that I want to play. So of course along this line you're going to see things like Broken Sword and Broken Sword 2, the point and click games, along with the Discworld games, and also a fair selection of arcade action games, because I still lusted for that type of game back then because it was the mid 90s and I hadn't quite lost my reflexes at that point. But of course, if there was one genre above them all that absolutely stood up, slapped me in the face, and that was the JRPG. Now, I had played RPG games before. I was introduced to JRPGs way back in the late 80s when Phantasy Star came out, and I got to watch a friend play it and got a little bit of game time myself. But I don't think I fully understood what was happening until obviously Final Fantasy came along in 1997. And after that point, it completely changed the way I gamed again. But there was much more to the PlayStation than just JRPGs for me. As I had said, Resident Evil had absolutely pulled me into the console way back in 96, and just the sheer variety of genre of game that you could get on that system was mind blowing at the time, and couple that with not only arcade quality graphics but near PC, top end PC graphics at the time. We really were spoiled for choice with the PlayStation, having everything from classic platformers and shoot 'em ups right through to ports from the PC such as Team Hospital, Command and Conquer, and the list could go on and on. It was just a wonderful console, a wonderful piece of kit, and a genius introduction to the gaming space by Sony. With the PlayStation down, we're dropping down a shelf and onto the other systems that I collect for. Now obviously these are not quite as large as the PlayStation collections, but I do like to pick up a few games for each of the systems that I own that are important to each of those systems. For example, on the Switch you're going to see Oddworld and you're going to see Final Fantasy repeated again, but you're going to see Final Fantasy repeated a lot anyway. And also where the Nintendo Switch is getting it right at the moment is with HD remasters of older games, and that's something that I'm totally down with. The GameCube collection's quite small, but I'm only really picking up things that I really want on that system at the moment, and for me that's important titles like Resident Evil, Eternal Darkness, and of course the Star Wars games too. And as I mentioned earlier, I have some of those blank spines up there that contain GameCube games, and what I'll do is throw in a little B-roll footage just so you can see those. Because as I said, they were a wonderful gift from a wonderful friend, and they contain some absolutely stunning games in there. Games that I would never have picked up, not quite so soon anyway, and I was very grateful to get those into the collection. The Nintendo Wii also falls into this category of me just simply picking up games that spark my interest, because although I've had a Wii for quite a while, it's not a go-to system for me. Every now and again, of course, I'll see a licensed game that I want to pick up and it'll be on the Wii, and that's fine with me as well. There's a couple of more Final Fantasy titles, and mostly everything else is just a selection of games that I've stumbled across, maybe on YouTube or somewhere else, and I've decided just to give it a go. Now, although the next shelf down does start with a couple of Switch titles, the Flashback Anniversary Edition and, yes, perky little things, this is mostly dedicated to Sega on this shelf. And Sega obviously resonates with me much more than Nintendo does. So when it comes to collecting for the Mega Drive especially, I tend just to aim for in-box and complete where I can. Now, of course, I'm not collecting heavily for the Mega Drive because I didn't spend a great deal of time with it. It was more of a side piece console while I was heavily into the early PC gaming scene. But there are a few games out there that I spent a lot of time with and I want back into the collection. And although I say I mostly collect in-box, complete where I can, I do have a couple of loose carts and I'll give you a look at those now. Marble Madness because Mark Cerny's my hero. PGA Tour Golf because I've always loved golf games. Shaq Fu because it's a must. Toe Jam and Earl, and again loopy but a must. And of course Revenge of Shinobi, Streets of Rage and Golden Axe all in one cart. An absolute beast of a compilation. Now I do have a few Mega Drive games that I still want into the collection, but this is not something I'm going to hurry with. Then we move on to this handful of Dreamcast games, complete in box. Now it's another system I'm not going to collect heavily for, and the Shenmue that you see there was a gift from the wonderful Retro Ed UK. And the bulk of my collection, well, it's all loose, and it was another gift from the friend who gifted me the GameCube games. And I think it's only fair for me to go through them with you now because there are some great titles in here. No, there's some fantastic titles in here. There's some of the classic fighting games and of course the Sonic games. Sega Rally, a game that you need to have. Games that I know absolutely nothing about. Resident Evil Code Veronica X, the last real Resident Evil game in my opinion, Power Stone 2, now I know these are quite heavy hitters when it comes to the Dreamcast, Jet Set Radio, a must have game, and it just really blows me away every time I flip through this wallet. Echo the Dolphin, a game that frustrated me no ends on the Mega Drive. Choo Choo Rocket, the game that people buy complete in box just simply for the box. Blue Stinger, a game that's definitely on my to play list, and even Phantasy Star Online in there. Now it is a wonderful selection of games and I was blown away with the generosity of my friend, and I have no idea how I would ever be able to repay him for this. This particular shelf comes to a close with some Nintendo DS games and I completely and utterly blame Retro Ed UK for that. And yes, the green spine start, so Roger Retro Gamer's going to be happy now, but they're only Xbox exclusive games. The next row of shelves is completely and utterly Microsoft, and by that I mean mostly Xbox One, Xbox 360 and original or OG Xbox. Now of course, being a Sony pony, there was a lot of games I missed back in the day because I didn't have an Xbox, and that's what this part of the collection is all about. It's about discovering games for the first time that I missed out back in the day, because despite being a Sony pony, I'm all about the video games first. Now there is one lone Master System game, and again it's a system that I never had back in the day, and I still don't have a Master System at the moment because I'm holding out for a Mark 1, well at least a Mark 1 at a price that I'm willing to pay for it. And then after that we have a selection of PC games. Now I have said that I was big into PC gaming back in the early 90s right through to the mid 90s, right up to the point I got a PlayStation in 1996, but there were still some games released later than that and into the early noughties that I absolutely adored, and I do have a selection I like to sit down with and play from time to time. And nestled in there with the PC games is the C64 Classics disc that the wonderful Retro Bear gifted me not that long ago, because I'm pretty sure he's trying to get this ZX Spectrum fanboy onto the Commodore bandwagon. Now I don't know if that'll work out for him, but he's welcome to give it a try anyway. Now above the shelves is pretty much a bit of a dumping ground at the moment, and it's where I tend to keep the big box Amiga and big box PC games. Now there's not a great deal of these either because the Amiga was a system that I never had back in the day, and in fact the only 16-bit microcomputer that I ever used was the Atari ST, and that was to play one game and one game alone, and that was the almighty Champ Manager. These games are all part of the Better Halves collection, well except for the PC games, the Sum of All Fears which was gifted to me by Gordon at Gib84, and the two ZX Spectrum games Super Space Invaders and Obliterator. Just to the right of the big box games and in front of the Microcomputers and of course that Binatone TV Pong game rests a selection of ZX Spectrum games that are a little bit more important to me. The Horizons Tech demo game that everyone got with their ZX Spectrum, Hungry Horus, the first game that I ever owned, and Orbiter, one of my most beloved games on the system itself, along with Final Fantasy Tactics on the Game Boy Advance, which was yet another gift from Gordon over at Gib84, and the truly awful Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles on the ZX Spectrum. Now, just in case anyone was worried I wasn't going to go through the rest of the ZX Spectrum games, I thought I would just pull them all out now. Now, I'm not collecting heavily for the ZX Spectrum because I can happily emulate that system, and I have been emulating it since the end of the 90s on a wonderful emulator called Fuse. And anyone who's half interested in dipping into the ZX Spectrum library, then I can heartily recommend Fuse. Now, of course, there are other emulators you can use, but Fuse has been going since, 1999, and has absolutely been my go-to emulator ever since. And as for the games themselves, if you want the ROMs of these games, that's up to you to go and hunt them, although you also have the option to buy the cassettes themselves and play them directly into your PC, if you're absolutely determined to have that almost authentic feel when it comes to loading the software, which can often take up to 5 minutes or more and crash on a regular basis. And original hardware and original software, well, that is for the truly hardcore, and I don't recommend it unless it's something that you not only grew up with but still stuck with it over the last 30 odd years. Now, of course, you can't play video games if you don't have the consoles to play the games on, and I believe that I have a fairly decent selection of video game consoles and other machines to play the games that I want to play. As you'll all know, the name of the channel is Generation Pixel, and that's quite simply because I'll play games from any generation and, well, on any system. And by any system, I mean quite frankly that. Anything from the mini systems that you get these days right through to the very classic Atari 2600. And of all the systems that you're going to see here, every single one of them is set up and ready to go. Well, except for the N64, but that's something that I'm working on at the moment. And something I suppose you don't see are the duplicate consoles, the consoles that I have more than one of. Because let's face it, as gamers, the last thing we want is a console to die on us, leaving us with no way to play the games that we want to play. So there you go, my friends, that's the state of play at Generation Pixel in 2023. Now, there is a fair bit of shovelware in the collection at the moment, but it's shovelware that I kinda want into the collection. And not only that, there are some impressive titles in there that I really needed back into my collection as well. Now, there were a few items that I didn't show, like spare consoles that I have just in case the emergency happens, and I think I also maybe have missed a little half shelf of games, and if I did, you know what? I'll drop it in here. And now we're at the part of the video that's all about you, because I would love for you to drop into the comments and let me know what you thought about what you saw. Any of these games favourites of yours, any of these games that you would have me fire into the sun and replace with something else, because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. Thank you very much for watching as always, and if you want to see more of the collection as it grew along the years, there's the pickups videos there. And if you just want to see some history of Generation Pixel, I'll drop the pixel years down there for you to peruse at your leisure. And again, thank you for watching, and until next time, cheerio!